So I'll start off by giving an example from an ML stereotype benchmark. This isn't to call this out specifically, but I just want to show this isn't sort of a randomly picked obscure benchmark, but this is a popularly used one. And so in this benchmark, they measure agreeing with any of these statements as an indicator of stereotyping. So one example is women are bad at math. Another example, and this is old people are bad at math. And yet another is Asian people are bad at math. And so actually this is not a stereotype, this is even an anti-stereotype, and the opposite has been shown to be true and harmful when people think that Asian people are too good at math. And so this sort of goes to show how our understanding of stereotypes in fair machine learning sometimes isn't indicative of the reality. And so stereotypes in fair machine learning, they're often invoked as justification for harm, and they're often thought to be obvious enough that as researchers we have access to all of them. They're just very straightforward and immediate. However, what we want to show is that not all associations are stereotypes. Often in the work we see that any association or correlation between a group and anything is called a stereotype and called harmful. And at the same time, not all stereotypes are even harmful. For instance, we have stereotypes that children are bad drivers. This could be a helpful stereotype. So in today's talk, I'm going to talk about some of our conceptual contributions, which are a class of harmful predictions, and also the relevant downstream harms we should be thinking about when we're talking about stereotypes. And then I'll talk about the methods we use, which is surveys, and some of our findings. And yes, the case study I'll talk about is gender stereotypes in an image search. And so for our conceptual contributions, we'll think about what kinds of predictions are harmful. It's easy to accept that incorrect classifications, so errors, are bad, and correct classifications are good, but instead, which kinds of errors are harmful? Not all errors are equally harmful. And so from errors, we can think about those that are associated with stereotypes. For instance, for image misclassification, something like oven, which has these sorts of associations, versus something more neutral like bowl. And then within the stereotypically associated objects, there can be misclassifications that reinforce stereotypes, but also those that violate stereotypes. So for instance, perhaps if we misclassify oven on woman, this reinforces stereotypes, but if we do the same thing on a picture of a man, this is a stereotype violating error. Versus if we misclassify bowl on either, these are sorts of neutral kinds of classification errors. And so the relevant kinds of harms we're thinking about here, we think about two kinds. One are pragmatic harms. These are the views held towards a stereotyped group. And in social psychology, there's three ways of thinking about this. There are cognitive beliefs that we hold in our minds about groups, then there are the attitudes that we can have about the groups, and then there are the expressed behaviors that people do. So for instance, the example is that we might have cognitive beliefs that women are warm but not competent. This leads to attitudes like having pity, and different sorts of attitudes about women, but this can lead to behaviors like not promoting women in the workplace. But these are three separate components, and they aren't even necessarily all correlated. And so here to measure pragmatic harms, we'll measure changes in these three measures towards the stereotyped group. The second form of harm we think about is experiential harm. These are those directly experienced by the subject. So we can think about this almost like microaggressions, which are these small sorts of harms. They're easily interpretable as inadvertent errors rather than as malevolent actions. This comes up a lot in image classification, where we might not attribute it as actually something evil done by the computer vision system, but happens and can build up over time and harm someone's personal experiences with these systems. And so here are measures just directly asking about an individual's experience, how they feel when they see misclassifications towards certain groups. And so for the methods, we have surveys to equal numbers of participants who identify as men and women. The task here is object recognition for photo search, like on our phone, if we search for particular objects like oven through our photos. And the data sets we look at are just two computer vision data sets called COCO and Open Images. All of these data sets have labeled in them the different objects in the images, as well as the perceived gender expression of the people. And so there are three parts to our study. First, we just annotate labels as stereotypes. This is sort of to understand what sorts of labels people perceive to be stereotypes in the first place. And to do this, we just ask participants. And here we find that in a lot of sort of prior work, they have made attributions. For instance, they've seen indications that women correlate with forks and spoons, men are correlating with computers, and these have all been called stereotypes and all been called harmful. But we actually find that none of those are perceived to be stereotypical by the people that we survey. While as people working in technology spaces, we might think that men and computers are a stereotype, but actually to the lay user, there is no such associated stereotype. There's nothing harmful associated with that. Then to measure the pragmatic harms, we show participants search engine results with different kinds of errors. So when oven is searched, there are misclassifications where there's woman but no actual oven, so false positives. And the same with men to show stereotype violating, and also neutral errors with objects like bowls. And then the way we measure for changes across these three sorts of dimensions, I'll just describe the one for behavior. So the online participants that we survey, oftentimes they're solicited to tag images for computer vision systems. So we have them actually perform this task. We task them to assign tags to these images, and based on the tags they assign, we're trying to measure whether they have stereotypical associations as the result of having seen sort of our stimulus of the images. And then finally, we measure experiential harms. Here we just directly ask participants about their emotional responses to different kinds of errors, asking them to rate along a number of dimensions how they feel for these errors. And so now I'll walk through some of the results. For annotating labels as stereotypes, we see that certain kinds of objects are more associated with men and others more associated with women. For instance, handbag, hairdryer are associated with women, and baseball glove, tie are associated with men. And we can also rank these on how harmful people think they are. So something like oven is perceived to be quite harmful stereotype versus things like potted plant and hairdryer, though people do agree this is a stereotype, they don't actually perceive them to be very harmful. Then looking at pragmatic and experiential harm, we find that stereotype reinforcing errors don't lead to pragmatic harm in this sort of lab study that we have. And here we sort of find that the long-term observational studies people are able to do, for instance, lots of studies about how children that watch TV shows which reinforce particular stereotypes might have effects on those children as they grow up. Those might be better suited to measure these kinds of harms compared to the short-term lab studies that we're able to run in this situation. And we also find that stereotype reinforcing errors lead to experiential harm, more so for women than men. So women will report that misclassifications of things like makeup and oven, these are considered harmful and they find them experientially harmful, versus men do not find these sorts of stereotype reinforcing errors to be as harmful. At the same time, we find that men actually report stereotype violating errors to lead to experiential harm for them. So for instance, men will report that misclassifications of makeup on men are more harmful than misclassifications of makeup on women. And so we might imagine that this is a case of some sort of transphobia and sort of reactions to this more than sorts of harms that we might care to actually mitigate. And so this really leads us to think about sort of whose harms we value, whose harms we will prioritize and also mitigate here. And so we can't just take reports of harm at face value. We have to think about where they come from. And so going through this, we're trying to think about who is being harmed. So stereotype harms are unequally distributed across groups. Women were reporting experiential harms in ways that men weren't, and yet men were reporting different kinds of harms, ones that we don't necessarily need to take at face value, but just sort of think through here. We should also think about which errors we care about. So errors here we sort of say can be neutral, stereotype reinforcing, or stereotype violating. And we find it important to differentiate between stereotype reinforcing or stereotype violating harms. So for instance, the example I gave at the beginning about being good at math, people have sometimes taken this just to be a stereotype applicable for all groups, but that's not true, and it really matters whether the particular stereotype is reinforcing or violating harms for particular groups. We also sort of find that because we're looking at objects and images in this case, stereotypes can be more than just occupations and traits. And so a lot of times prior work will focus on occupations and traits as the domains where stereotypes can manifest, but this can happen across other domains as well. And then finally, in thinking about what ways we can actually draw out where the stereotype leads to the harm, rather than just assuming that all stereotypes are harmful, we sort of think about pragmatic and experiential harms as the ways that social psychology has tended to think about the route that it takes from the representational harm to actually the person experiencing it. Thank you.